Someone once said that the Constitution of Kenya has captured, the will of the Kenyan society, and that we are finally in Canaan, governed by the right laws. And I want us to analyze the veracity of this particular statement. You see, the statement reflects the optimism that followed the promulgation of the Constitution of Kenya 2010, which was widely celebrated as a transformative constitution. It suggests that the Constitution embodies the collective will of Kenyan society and provides an ideal legal order that is canon, grounded in justice, grounded in democracy, and also grounded in good governance. Now, the key issue is whether the Constitution truly reflects the will of the people and whether it has successfully delivered the promise of a new Kenya. You see, under Article 1, sovereign power belongs to the people of Kenya and is exercised through representatives and direct participation. Article 10 further entrenches, national values such as democracy, the rule of law, social justice, and participation of the people. These provisions give constitutional weight to the idea that the Constitution is a product of popular sovereignty. However, the practical reality is more complex and contested. Now, let's analyze the argument supporting the statement that the Constitution reflects the will of the people. Now, the first argument supporting the statement that the Constitution reflects the will of the people is popular participation in constitutional making. You see, the 2010 Constitution was the product of decades of constitutional reform struggles, decades of civic education, decades of public consultation, and decades of, a national referendum. And this gives it, a strong, democratic kind of legitimacy. It is, in fact, widely regarded as a people-driven constitution, unlike the 1963 Independence Constitution, which was actually elite-driven. The second argument supporting the statement that the Constitution reflects the will of the people is constitutional supremacy and sovereignty of the people. You see, Article 2.1 declares, the Constitution of Kenya as the supreme law of the land, so that Article 1 vests sovereignty in the people. And this aligns with the idea that law derives legitimacy from the people it governs. Now, in the case of the Speaker of the Senate versus Attorney General, the facts of this case, involved dispute on division of power between national and county governments. And the issue was whether constitutional interpretation must reflect, devolution principles. And the rule is that constitution, must be interpreted in line with these values and purposes. And the application of this particular case was that the Supreme Court emphasized democratic principles and popular sovereignty. The conclusion of this particular case is that devolution was actually affirmed. The significance of this case is that the court reinforced the idea that the Constitution reflects the will of the people through decentralization and democratic governance. Now, the third argument supporting the statement that the Constitution reflects the will of the people is a strong Bill of Rights. You see, the Constitution expanded rights significantly. And we have Article 27, which talks of equality, dignity in Article 28, socioeconomic rights in Article 43, and fair trial in Article 50. You see, this reflects, societal demand for justice after years of authoritarian kind of rule. In the case of Me Too Bell Welfare Society versus Kenya Airports Authority, the first of this particular case concerned, forced evictions of informal settlers. And the issue was whether socioeconomic rights were enforceable. And the rule is that Article 43 guarantees housing and dignity. And the application of this particular case was that the Supreme Court enforced constitutional rights, and the conclusion was that the evictions were found to be unconstitutional. Now, the significance of this case is that the court gave effect to constitutional promises of social justice. Now, let's analyze the argument against the statement that the Constitution, fully captures, the will of the people. Now, the first argument against the statement that the Constitution fully captures the will of the people is implementation gap. You see, although the Constitution is progressive, its implementation is inconsistent, and problems include corruption, weak institution, delayed reforms, and political resistance. Thus, the canon ideal, remains incomplete. The second argument against the statement that the Constitution fully captures, the will of the people is elite domination in practice. You see, despite democratic design, political elites dominate governance. Public participation is sometimes symbolic, and decisions are often centralized in practice. And you see, this undermines the idea of full popular control. The third argument against the statement that the Constitution fully captures the will of the people is unfulfilled constitutional promises. You see, key constitutional provisions remain partially implemented, and a good example is the two-thirds gender rule, Article 81B of the Constitution. So that full realization of socioeconomic rights and equitable development across regions is still wanting in Kenya. And this shows, a gap between constitutional text and lived reality. If you look at the case of Center for Rights Education and Awareness versus Attorney General, the facts of this particular case was failure to implement gender representation requirements. And the issue was whether Parliament violated constitutional obligations. And the rule is that gender equality is mandatory under Article 27 and 81B. And the application of this particular case is that the court acknowledged constitutional duty but highlighted implementation failure. The conclusion of this case was that there was a need for compliance with gender rule. And the significance of this case is that it shows constitutional ideas not fully realized in practice. Now, let's look at the tension between constitutional idealism and reality. You see, the Constitution of Kenya 2010 is aspirational in that it has, the ideal vision of society. It is also normative in that it sets standards for governance. However, society is unequal, society is politically contested, and society is economically divided. Thus, a gap exists, between constitutional of Kenya versus, the real Kenya. If you look at the case of Raila Odinga versus IBC 2017, the facts of this particular case concerned, presidential election dispute. And the issue was whether the election met constitutional standards. And the rule is that elections must be free, they must be fair, and they must also be transparent. And the application of this particular case was that the Supreme Court nullified elections due to irregularities. And the conclusion of this particular case was that the elections were held to be invalid. Now, the significance of this case is that even constitutional democracy faces institutional weaknesses. Now, let's carry out a critical evaluation of the Canaan metaphor. Now, the term Canaan in Kenya implies arrival at a promised land. It implies full realization of justice, and it also implies, absence of governance problems. However, constitutional development is a process. It is not an event. Kenya has made progress but has not reached, the level of perfection. So that achievement, that is progress towards Canaan, include, a strong constitutional framework. It includes, independent judiciary. It includes expanded human rights. It includes, devolution of power, and it also includes public participation principles. Now, the challenges, that is, we are still in the wilderness, includes, corruption in public sector. It includes inequality and poverty. And you see, this also slows, judicial processes. And we also have the idea of political interference and ethnic politics, which are big and very serious challenges in Kenya. Now, let's look at the theoretical perspective of law. Roscoe Pound views law as social engineering. Pound argues that law is meant to balance competing social interests and guide society towards, improvement. Thus, constitution is a tool for transformation, But transformation, requires implementation. Avi Dacey came up with the idea of a rule of law, and Dacey emphasized, supremacy of law. He emphasized equality before law, and he also emphasized, absence of arbitrary power. Kenyan constitution reflects, these ideals, but enforcement still remains uneven. So, what is the judicial role in realizing constitutional will? You see, Kenyan courts have been central in bridging the gap between constitutional promise and reality. If you look at the case of Doctors for Life International versus Speaker of the National Assembly, court emphasize public participation as essential to legitimacy. If you look at the case of Me Too Bell Welfare Society versus KAM, courts expanded, socioeconomic rights enforcement. These cases show that courts are acting as guardians of constitutional will in Kenya. Now, here is a critical assessment of the statement that the Constitution of Kenya has captured the will of the Kenyan people. We are finally in Canaan, governed by the right laws. You see, the strength of the statement is that the Constitution is people driven. We have a strong Bill of Rights. There is participatory governance principles. There is devolution, which reflects, regional will, and there is judicial enforcement of rights. The weakness of the statement are that there is implementation gaps, there is a light capture of institution, there is persistent inequality, there is corruption, and there is also incomplete realization of rights. The conclusion is that the statement is partly true, but overly, idealistic. The Constitution of Kenya 2010 does indeed reflect, a broad expression of the Kenyan people's aspiration through participatory constitutional reform and entrenched, democratic principles. It has significantly improved governance, it has improved right protection, and it has also improved institutional accountability. However, the idea that Kenya is finally in Canaan is not fully accurate. While the constitutional framework is strong and transformative, its full realization is hindered by implementation challenges, by political realities, and also by socioeconomic inequalities. Therefore, Kenya is not yet in Canaan, but it has a powerful constitutional roadmap towards Canaan. My name is Biketi. If it is your first time here, make sure you follow this channel and you subscribe for more legal lessons.